This beautiful Alabama girl leaves on her senior trip to Aruba and disappears.
Police today intensified the search for a missing 13-year-old girl.
There has been a massive investigation underway in this tiny, tiny town.
If you repeatedly see the same types of missing persons getting national coverage or even international coverage, whether it's an intentional decision or not, you are sending messages about the inherent worth or value of those cases. Missing white woman syndrome hypothesizes that young white girls and white women, and especially white girls and white women who come from higher socioeconomic statuses, and or fit traditional definitions of beauty, that those individuals are more likely to gain a disproportionate share of news coverage when they go missing.
I call it the missing white woman syndrome. If there's a missing white woman, we're going to cover that every day.
I think that part of the reason why those stories get such a disproportionate share of news coverage is that they fit into a type of narrative that we are intimately familiar with, especially in the U.S. context. And that's the narrative of a damsel in distress. The idea that there's a young woman or a young girl who needs to be saved is something that we grew up with fairy tales. We hear it in stories all the time as kids. Generally, what the research has found is that the patterns are that both the language used and other aspects like pictures used differ based on the race of the victim that's being covered. So, for example, we see with stories about violent crime more broadly that suspects of color are more likely to be presented in threatening manner. So whether that's wearing certain types of clothing or being shown in handcuffs or a mugshot, as opposed to, for example, a graduation photo or something along those lines. We might hear a victim, a white victim described as a student or a blue-eyed beauty, something along those lines, if they are white.
For a vigil in support of Gabby Petito, they are now calling her America's daughter.
The picture of a joyful young woman with so much life ahead of her.
And the language used when describing a missing person of color is different and more either more neutral or even more explicitly negative in terms of tone. Intuitively, it seems likely that we see a differential in resource allocation when it comes to cases that get a significant amount of coverage. We don't have enough data to say that for sure empirically, but it seems like if there's a case like a Gabby Petito where there's not just national pressure from a PR standpoint, but international pressure to solve this case and solve it quickly, that would have an effect on investigation outcomes. With respect to the cases that don't get as much coverage, I think, again, the corollary there would be something similar, that police feel less of a sense of urgency there. There's also some data to suggest that police might be more likely to characterize people of color who go missing as runaways, especially if they're adolescents or teenagers. It shouldn't necessarily just be the Gabby Petitos of the world who get this coverage. We don't need to take any coverage away from Gabby Petito. No one is suggesting that her case is not important or worthy of coverage. We're simply saying that we need to broaden the horizons here. We need to be covering other folks as well. We can do a better job of, when we highlight a few of those, of making sure that it's a representative sample, both from a class perspective, a race perspective, a gender perspective.
I want them to look for my child like they're looking for her. He is not a nobody. I want them to give my son the same attention.
When we see families who have been struggling for years to get news coverage for their loved ones, and families of, with a person of color who's gone missing, and they haven't been able to do so, and then they watch the Petito family in a matter of days, that just opens up that wound all over again for those families. And it reinforces for them the disparities in news coverage and the power dynamics at play here, where they think to themselves, what do I have to do to get my loved one news coverage here? The tone and the scope of the conversation this time feels different to me. There are far more people having this conversation. It's far more mainstream. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that this might be a turning point. But the key issue here is dialogue is the first step. Tangible progress is the next step. So how do we leverage this into making sure that these disparities actually start to get reduced? We have seen in the short term, I think, increased coverage of underrepresented demographics. The next step here is making sure that those trends are maintained long term, and that this is something that momentum keeps building here, and it's not something that just fades to the background.